Hey, we're going to be talking about Plato's Timaeus. And um, I think that you're going to find that this is a text that is pretty interesting. It's one of Plato's most unusual dialogues because here we find Socrates occupying the position of a more passive receiver of the discourse of Timaeus, um, and another guest. He's welcoming two guests into his home, and he's quietly listening to what they have to say, but he himself doesn't say much, and that's very different from what we find in most of Plato's dialogues, where Socrates is a more active kind of player. Now, of course, Plato obviously puts words into the mouth of Socrates in these various dialogues. And Socrates is a kind of a character that he creates in these dialogues, but he was himself an actual historical personage, of course. And here we find Plato via this vehicle in the mouth of Timaeus, who's giving this discourse contemplating the beginnings of the world. This is essentially a creation story. Um, in the medieval period in Europe, this was the one of the most important texts of Plato. It's not perhaps read by as many today, unless you're interested in continental philosophy. Certainly in the writings of figures like Derrida and Heidegger, because here's where we find Plato talking about the problem of quora, which is one of the basic concepts of metaphysics that we're going to be reviewing. And I find this dialogue to be really important, particularly for students of literature, literary criticism, literary theory, because here we find Plato in a very succinct way articulating the basic concepts of metaphysics. One needs these concepts to understand these concepts before one can do a whole lot of work in critical theory. For instance, reading the writings of Heidegger. And so I would suggest to you that if you attend very carefully to these texts, if you pay attention to them and think about them, they can be useful to you, again, as a kind of a compass to navigate your way through contemporary critical theory, but also through the history of philosophy as well, because to read philosophy, you have to have some grounding in metaphysics. And so we'll look at what Plato says, and we'll compare it to what other philosophers have said, just a few select philosophers regarding these concepts as well. And again, this is a basic introduction to the concepts of metaphysics. It's not a lecture in certainly in Greek scholarship. We're reading Plato in translation, and it's intended for readers of theory and Plato who are new to these ideas. So, but again, let me just urge you to attend very carefully to these concepts. Pay attention to the words on the page, or in this case, I'm going to put some words on the screen because I think you'll find them to be very useful to you down the road when you're trying to read more complicated texts by figures like Heidegger and Derrida, for instance. Okay, so I'm going to start with a kind of a slideshow here. Excuse me, I have to give you fair warning that I am myself learning this technology for the first time, and so consequently, I think as I do more of these lectures, I'll get better at the technology. But this is a new program that I just am in the process of learning. So I do apologize if there's some disruptions. Okay, so here's an image painted, a very famous image painted by the painter Raphael, and Raphael was drawing a painting. This is an image from it. It's actually a much larger painting, but he's doing a painting of of Plato there, holding in his academy, and the book that I might note that Plato is holding in his hand. If you read very closely, he's reading the Timaeus, which was in the period when Raphael painted this painting, a figure that loomed large in the European imagination, because again we find in the Timaeus Plato meditating on the story of creation, which is which we get in the Western tradition, not just from the Book of Genesis, but from the actual texts of Plato. Now here are the basic concepts. I've written them down here, typed them out, I should say. And that's just these three, but we'll keep coming back to these three over and over again. And they're really worth, in each and every case, carefully meditating upon. Now, as we're going to see for Plato and for Heidegger as well, these are interdependent concepts, which means that one concept implies the other. Okay. Now, meta, it means beyond. Physics deals with the question of the physical. There are a couple of different views out there, predominant views regarding how this word came to be coined by Aristotle. And it can mean what is beyond the physical, or it could simply be a book that was attached after Aristotle's physics. But in any case, it works both ways, because it's beyond the physical is one way of thinking about, particularly if we're trying to understand Platonic idealism, what being is for Plato. It is something that is transcendental, and what transcendental means is beyond the five senses. And so when I use this word transcendental, I'm not speaking about it, for instance, in Hegelian terms, which we could discuss also at another point, but rather just something beyond the five senses. And the realm of being is, for Plato, what is something that is truly there, what he's going to call the truly existing intangible essence, but it is not something that is accessible within the realm of the five senses, not directly accessible, or as we'll see in the Phaedrus, is something that we can only see but through a glass darkly. And that was obviously that's a line that is prominent in the writings of the Apostle Paul, when he says, now we see but through a glass darkly. In eternity we shall see face to face. But this was also something that was in the writings of Plato some 500-600 years before Paul coined that expression, or he didn't coin it. I guess he copied Plato, perhaps. Who knows? Becoming is the realm of the five senses, what you can see, smell, taste, touch, hear, and so on. And it is also the realm of temporality. It's the realm of time, as opposed to the realm of being, which is the realm beyond time. We're going to talk a little bit later about time and temporality. Non-being is the realm of the chora, the choral abyss. Now, this is perhaps the most, Plato himself will say to us, this is the most difficult to understand of the basic concepts of metaphysics. And so we'll have to wrestle around a bit with it. But we're going to see also that in contemporary critical theory, for instance, in the work of Heidegger, Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, Jacques Derrida, among others, this becomes a very central concept or central notion. And John Caputo, in his book Deconstruction in a Nutshell, is going to say that chora is a Sir word for Derrida's term différance. Well, this is something that we'll return to later, but I mentioned that now because the word chora can be something that can help us understand what often seem to be very inaccessible concepts in contemporary critical theory. It can make those concepts far more accessible. But write these down if you're taking notes. Focus on them. Think about them. If as we're going through them, by attending to Plato's actual definitions of these terms, if they're not, if it's not clear to you, I suggest to you that in time it will become clear, because these concepts will keep recurring in the philosophical texts that we'll be looking at, among other texts. All right, so here is in Timaeus, Plato calls this distinction between being, becoming, and non-being. He says, for the moment, we must make a threefold distinction and think of that which becomes, that in which it becomes, and the model it resembles. We may indeed use the metaphor of birth and compare the receptacle to the mother, the model to the father, and the material they produce between them to their offspring. Well, now that's worth thinking about for just a minute. It also, one thing that should stand out right away when you read that quote is how these terms come to be gendered, how the term of the quora comes to be associated with the feminine. Indeed, Plato's going to call quora a kind of a nursemaid, compare quora to the womb, and so we think of quora as a womb, as a receptacle. It's something that is definitely for him a concept that he associates with the feminine. Logos, as we're going to see by contrast, which is the ideal word that is inscribed on the soul, which partakes of being in Plato, is going to be associated with the masculine, with the seed, with the semen, with phallus. This is something that later critics are going to deconstruct in Plato when they speak of the Plato's phallologocentrism. Right. Well, that's a term that we'll come back to. But we have three concepts. Again, I want to really emphasize that these are interdependent concepts. All right, and one of these concepts for Plato necessarily implies the other, and that's something that's really I don't really want us to emphasize the importance of that. But it is a metaphor, and because we're reading philosophy as literature, it is something that it's worth also noting here. We can think about it in poetic terms as well. But what comes to be in the realm of becoming, what is born, comes from being, but it requires a place. And quora is that place. It is for Plato that placeless place. But you can see here, I would note also in passing if you're thinking, for instance, that it sounds a bit like Holy Trinity. Well, there's something to that. Father, Son is a representation of the Father. The realm of becoming, the Father in heaven is the transcendental figure of the ideal. And we're going to find this same kind of thinking not only in the Christian tradition, but preceded, anticipated in Platonic idealism as well. All right, Heidegger puts it this way, and he's also underscores in his introduction to metaphysics this idea of what he calls a threefold path. And I think his description of the threefold path is particularly illuminating, and so I want to draw your attention to it for just a moment here. Let's read Heidegger's exact language here. Heidegger says, the threefold path provides this indication, unitary in itself. The way to being is unavoidable. The way to nothing is inaccessible. The way to seeming is always accessible and traveled, but it can be avoided. All right, now note for Heidegger as well, what Plato calls a threefold distinction is for Heidegger a threefold path. And Heidegger likes to think of philosophy as a way or a path that we walk upon, perhaps, for instance, in the woods. And he's going to tell us here, note that the way to being, cannot avoid it. The way to nothing is something that we have no access to. And the way to seeming is something that we can access and travel upon, but it can be avoided. Interesting way that he phrases this, problematic. Here's Heidegger again. Let's read him on the threefold path. He says, so the man who truly knows is not the one who blindly runs after a truth, but only the one who constantly knows all three ways. Note the emphasis on their interdependence. That of being, that of non-being, and that of seeming. Superior knowing, and all knowing is superior, is only granted to the one who has experienced the sweeping storm on the way to being, to whom the terror of the second way to the abyss of nothing has not remained foreign, and who has still taken over the third way of seeming as a constant urgency. To dare everything with being, not being, and seeming all at once, that is, to raise Dasein above itself into the decision about being, not being, and seeming. Now, this word Dasein is often left untranslated in Heidegger. One could translate it as being there. It's a figure for the sort. He prefers to use this term rather than the human. It's a figure of a being who is there, a Dasein, or the entity that we are, translated sometimes as existence. This is a term. This is where we get the term existentialism from. But it was a term that Heidegger was not that. He wasn't comfortable with that term. He rejected it, and so it's often left translated as Dasein, right? Which means you, me, who we are, the being that we are in the world. So I note then that Heidegger is really underscoring the importance of all three ways. One for him implies the other. I want to, again, really emphasize that. Okay, let me pull back my image here. And just one sec. Okay, so you may be a little befuddled if you're looking at these concepts for the first time. And it's worth taking it slow. It's worth thinking about them carefully. So let's just pause for a minute and think about this a little bit more carefully. We're going to look at how Aristotle, we'll look in a moment at his principle of non-contradiction as well. But let's start with being. All right, the thing that one of the things that makes being difficult to talk about is that being for Plato is something that really is. It really does exist. When we think of being, we're not talking about a ghost. We're not talking about we're not talking about nothing at all. We're talking about something that really is there, but it's not immediately available to us. It's not something that we can directly perceive. Plato's going to say in the Phaedrus that there are few who can apprehend being's disclosure, and but with great difficulty. And they see it, as I said, like through a glass darkly. He's going to describe it in terms of a shine from within. And so when one sees one apprehends the glow, the shine of being, but that is different from having an actual direct perception of it. So whatever he means by being, this essence that truly is the thing that is the thing that it is, it's not something that we can that we have immediate access to through our senses. But what we have to underscore is that it really is there. It's not nothing. And this is, a crucial point to emphasize, because nothingness is what isn't. It's what is not there. And so we get into this sort of this dialectic of being and nothingness, or what one might call Hamlet's question: to be or not to be, being, non-being, being, non-being. And they're quite distinct from becoming, because becoming is something that we can perceive, that we can have some kind of empirical experience of, as opposed again to being, which is actually present. There's something that is actually there. There is a there, to contradict Mrs. Stein, but the there that is there is not immediately available to us in any sort of way that we can perceive empirically. Now, nothingness, by contrast, is absolute non-being. Nothingness is not there, and that's really what we have to kind of try to get our mind around a little bit. Okay, so let's take a moment and focus on the way that Aristotle is going to articulate this, and he's going to, in his Metaphysics, articulate what's called sometimes the law of non-contradiction, the principle of non-contradiction. You can Google this. You'll find a Wikipedia page that'll give you information on this. But here, you can also, of course, read it in his Metaphysics. It's in the first, maybe first 40 pages or so. But in any case, Aristotle says, it is impossible for the same thing at the same time both to be in and not be in the same thing in the same respect. Well, there it is. There's the whole principle, and it's, again, worth pausing on, because Aristotle is going to say that this is the founding principle, the axiom. This is the founding axiomatic principle of all philosophical discourse. All of philosophy comes, from this principle. Later, we'll talk about Leibniz's principle of reason. These are the two key principles, for instance, for Heidegger. But the principle of non-contradiction is really the oldest and the most founding, the founding principle of philosophy. Later, someone like John Locke is going to, he's not going to accept this principle or any articulated principle of this nature, but this is where philosophical discourse for Aristotle, as well as for Plato and Heidegger, really comes from. This notion that a thing cannot, at the same time, the same thing at the same time can't both be in and not be in the same thing in the same respect. Well, the simpler way to say that, again, Hamlet's question: being, non-being, being, non-being. But what is being, and what is non-being? And the problem with saying what is non-being is that non-being is not, and there we have a basic problem that defies logic. And this is something that Plato wrestles with, and why he's going to call core, or non-being, very difficult to talk about, because it seems to short circuit rational discourse. All right, well, let's look at here's Aristotle again. Let's continue. He's going to say that no one can both believe that the same thing both is and is not. Well, there's another way of saying this. No one can both believe that the same thing both is and is not. Or he says, it is impossible to believe that the same thing both is and is not at the same time. For if one were to fall into such an error, it would amount to the simultaneous holding of opposite beliefs with regard to that object. That is why this principle is the ultimate root of all demonstration. It is its very nature to be the principle of all other axioms. All right, so here's a reason why it's worth your time to pause a little bit and think about this principle. But to think about it, you have to ask yourself, what is being, what is non-being? And how do they differ from becoming? Well, we already said becoming is something, anything in the realm of the five senses that's available to us is something that we can refer to as existing in the realm of becoming. This is the realm of change, of temporality, as opposed to the realm of being, which is eternal and timeless, which really is there, but is something that we cannot directly perceive in the in the realm of becoming that we inhabit. And non-being is what simply is not. It's absolute non-existence, nothingness. All right, and again, the problem of nothingness will lead many to think of contemporary theorists like Derrida and Heidegger as nihilists because of their interest in posing the question of non-being. This is something that we'll have to return to. But for now, all we're trying to do is clarify these basic concepts, particularly for those of you coming to them for the first time. Okay, so let's continue. Heidegger, in the first sentence of his introduction to metaphysics, puts it this way: why are there beings instead of nothing at all? That is the question. You could say, he could be quoting Hamlet here. To be or not to be, that is the question. All right, but he puts it this way: why are there beings instead of nothing at all? That is the question. Presumably, it is no arbitrary question. Why are there beings instead of nothing at all? This is obviously the first of all questions. Heidegger's going to say this is the question that is first in rank. And his book, Introduction to Metaphysics, is essentially it's a gloss on that question, because he begins with that question and he poses that question and he works with that question, and it remains for Heidegger a question rather than a thesis. Why are there beings instead of nothing at all? That is the question. Presumably, it is no arbitrary question. Now, Heidegger is going to suggest that all of us at some point ask this question, and asking this question is philosophizing, which he distinguishes from the history of philosophy itself. But the question that he asks is anticipated in the thought of Plato. It's anticipated in the thought of Aristotle, and as Heidegger is going to remind us, it doesn't necessarily make one a nihilist to be interested in the question of nothingness, because this question has accompanied philosophy since its inception, and in that sense, there's really no way to evade the question, and Heidegger likes to remind his readers of that fact. All right. Now, in Plato, let's focus more squarely now on Plato's articulation of these concepts. And here's Plato's commenting upon questions of form, copy, and receptacle. You can think of form as the ideal being, and being, copy as what exists in the realm of becoming, which is a copy of the form. The receptacle is the chora, or the place, the placeless place, the spaceless space, the stage upon which we could say the being of beings appears. Here is Plato. It must be agreed that there exists, first, the unchanging form. This would be the ideal form in the realm of being, uncreated and indestructible, admitting no modification and entering no combination, imperceptible to sight or the other senses, the object of thought. Well, there's a very nice and succinct definition of the form, the ideal form that exists in the realm of being: unchanging, uncreated, indestructible, admitting no modification, imperceptible to sight or the other senses. It is the object of thought. Second, that which bears the same name as the form and resembles it. This is what exists in the realm of becoming, which is a representation of what exists in the realm of being, but is sensible, has come into existence, is in constant motion, comes into existence and vanishes from a particular place and is apprehended by opinion with the aid of sensation. Okay, so note there, if we're thinking about questions of time and temporality, we can see that that time is something that comes into being in the realm of becoming, because the realm of being is the realm of that is outside of time, or that is timeless. And one of the reasons why Plato is going to describe the realm of becoming as a kind of a shadowy, illusory realm is precisely because it doesn't endure forever. It passes into non-existence. It's here, but for a short period of time. All right, and then the receptacle, which is here translated as space. This is problematic. Heidegger will sometimes refer to the Cora as space, and Derrida, for instance, will criticize him for this, because space cannot be thought of in Cartesian terms, because what we're calling space here is also spaceless, or we could call it a place, like a stage, for instance, upon which a dance takes place. We get the word choreography, but it is also a stage that is nowhere, that is no place, a placeless place. Derrida in Spectres of Marx will speak of it in terms of a desert. It's akin to an empty desert. Space, which is eternal and indestructible, which provides a position for everything that comes to be, and which is apprehended without the senses by a kind of spurious reasoning, and so is hard to believe in. We look at it indeed in a kind of dream and say that everything that exists must be somewhere and occupy some space, and that which is nowhere in heaven or earth is nothing at all. My verdict, in short, may be stated as follows. There were, before the world came into existence, being, space, and becoming, three distinct realities. Well, there they are again. All right, so these are Plato himself. Let's note, Plato himself is going to say these are Cora is difficult to understand. We can only understand it but through a kind of a spurious reasoning, but it defies our ability to come to terms with it. And part of the reason why this is the case is because reason, what we're going to call the logos, what we'll see Plato calls the logos, is something that is in being. Logos is an essence in being, is the truly existing intangible essence, and so therefore it exists. It is. How do we talk rationally about what is not? Heidegger is going to observe that many modern philosophers say there's nothing to say about being, so why talk about it? It's a question that we will most certainly return to. Okay. I'd like to take a moment now and focus on what will become, as we'll see later, Heidegger's critique of Plato's metaphysics. Here's what Heidegger is going to say. And this is just a brief foretaste of things to come. And those of you who are not reading Heidegger, who have no intentions or plans of reading Heidegger in the future, can at least get a little glimpse here of what Heidegger finds problematic about Plato's metaphysics. Here's Heidegger in Introduction to Metaphysics. Only the latecomers, with their overly clever wit, believe they can be done with the historical power of seeming by explaining it as subjective, quote unquote, where the essence of this subjectivity is something extremely dubious. Now, this is one of the reasons why Heidegger uses the term Dasein, because the word subjective he finds to be very problematic. Now, this is a implicit dig at Kant, Hegel, Marx, and at dialectical subjectivity, dialectical epistemologies predicated on subjectivity, which he's going to reject. This is why, again, he prefers this word Dasein, or the being that is there, to this term, the human subject, which he rejects. Okay, well, that doesn't get us any closer to his critique of Plato, but it tells us something that we should think about for just a moment here. Then he's going to say the Greeks, and what he means by this is before Plato, because in some sense Heidegger is trying to come back to a thinking that existed in Greece prior to Plato. The Greeks experienced it otherwise. Again and again, they had first to tear being away from seeming and preserve it against seeming. Only by undergoing the struggle between being and seeming did they wrest being forth from beings. Did they bring beings into constancy and unconcealment. Only with the sophists and Plato was seeming explained as, and thus reduced to, mere seeming. At the same time, being as idea was elevated to the supersensory realm. The chasm, again, the reference to the chora here, chorismos, was torn open between the merely apparent beings here below and the real being somewhere up there. Christian doctrine then established itself in this chasm, while at the same time reinterpreting the below as created and the above as creator. And with weapons thus forged, it set itself against antiquity and distorted it. And so Nietzsche is right to say that Christianity is Platonism for the masses. Okay, pretty strong criticism there, but it gives you a sense of Heidegger's disdain for the way in which Plato, as he says here, is going to elevate the realm of being to this kind of supersensible ideal world that's totally bifurcated from the realm of becoming, that can even allow us to think of being and becoming as so completely separate from one another that a kind of a chasm opens up between the two. And again, remember, for Heidegger, the concepts of being, becoming, and non-being are interdependent. Plato, that's the case in Plato as well, as we've already seen, but it depends on how you read Plato, and the way that, for instance, what Derrida is going to refer to as what he calls the Plato effect, because historically Plato has been read as an idealist, and part of the reason, as a strict idealist strictly speaking, although this tendency is already present, obviously, in the work of Plato, it's going to be the Christian tradition that Heidegger is going to see as sort of finally severing the absolute, supersensible, ideal realm of being from the world of becoming, so that we have no entry into the world of being, and this is something that Heidegger is going to lament in the thought of Plato, or find deeply problematic in the thought of Plato. Okay, but let's again, we're working on all three of these concepts at the same time. So let's now focus for just a moment on the idea of becoming, what Plato calls becoming. And one way of thinking about the becoming is to think of, to focus a little bit on what Plato calls the four primal elements. Here's Plato in Timaeus. As for the world, it has come into being, for it is visible, tangible, and corporeal, and therefore perceptible by the senses, and sensible things are the objects of opinion and sensation, and therefore change and come into being. If the world is beautiful and its maker good, clearly he had his eye on the eternal. For the world is the fairest of all things that have come into being, and he is the best of causes. That being so, the world must have been constructed on the pattern of what is apprehensible by reason and understanding and eternally unchanging. For that which it follows, for which again it follows that the world is a likeness of something else. And so we might note again that the realm of becoming is a representation of the realm of being. It is a copy of the realm of being, a shadow perhaps of the realm of being. What Plato calls the four primal elements are fire, water, earth, and air. He says we must consider what was the nature of fire, water, earth, and air before the beginning of the world and what their state was then. No one has explained their origin, but we talk as if people knew what fire and each of the others are, the four primal elements, and treat them as the alphabet of the universe. Our own position may be defined as follows. It is not for us to describe the original principle or principles, call them what you will, of the universe. You must not expect such a description from me, nor could I persuade myself that I was right to undertake a task of such magnitude. So we find Plato here, he will speak in the Timaeus of the four primal elements as being, the building blocks, the alphabet of the universe. But when pressed hard enough, he's not going to. He basically says, I'm not going to speculate on what. He's not. He does. Plato is. Aristotle is. Perhaps influenced or in dialogue with Democritus and his atomic theory, like what are the smaller units of matter, of physical matter, than the four primal elements. But Plato is not. He doesn't really go there. So we just have these four elements, and we find that in the realm of becoming for Plato, one element can easily combine with another, or it can transform into another. There is in the world of becoming, it's constantly a world of change, but everything, all matter that exists for Plato in the realm of becoming he will speak of in terms of these four elements, and will effectively evade the question of atoms. He doesn't go to the realm of atomic theory. Okay. So note here's Plato speaking of how the elements transform themselves. He says, take for instance water. We see it, as we suppose, solidifying into stones and earth, and again dissolving and evaporating into wind and air. Air by combustion becomes fire, and fire in turn, when extinguished and condensed, takes the form of air again. Whenever we see anything in the process of change, we should speak of it not as being a thing, but having a quality. And so note then again that in the realm of becoming, there's this constant change in which each of the elements becomes dissolved and evaporated, changed into the other, and into one of the other elements. And so there's no element that remains the same for Plato. Okay. All right, let's move on now to the question of the Quora. We'll think a little bit more about this, and again, we're going to have to keep working on this because it is a very difficult question, and it's one that again we can't really say much definitively about it. We just have to keep coming back to it, circling back to it, re-articulating the problematic, as philosophers have done for centuries. So here's Plato on the Quora. Our argument compels us to try to describe in words a form that is difficult and obscure. It is the receptacle, the nurse of becoming and change. All right, so note there, sometimes he refers to it as the matrix. So it's a matrix, a womb, a receptacle, a nursemaid, literally a kind of a wet nurse. So again, it's feminized. But it's going to be seen as a place of where the seed of logos germinates. The natural receptacle of all bodies can always be called the same because it never alters its characteristics, for it continues to receive all things and never itself takes a permanent impress from any of the things that enter it. It is a kind of neutral plastic material on which changing impressions are stamped by the things which enter it, making it appear different at different times. Okay, so that's a pretty interesting formulation there. And we're going to see, later, for instance, John Locke will speak of what he calls the blank slate. And so the core is think of it like, if you think of a piece of paper, for the letters to be written on the piece of paper, the condition of those letters' coherence is necessarily the white spaces that must appear and that must be present, or absently present, I should say, in order for the letters that are inscribed upon it to become intelligible. And so thinking of Cora as a kind of a blank space is like a blank sheet of paper is one way of understanding it. What appears, in between the lines. So it's what the there that is there is not there, but it's necessarily not there. It's a condition of being there, being intelligible, is that there be something not there, so that what is there can appear. All right, let's see what else he says. He says, if an imprint is to present a very complex appearance, the material on which it is to be stamped will not have been properly prepared unless it is devoid of all characteristics which it is to receive. For if it were like any of the things that enter it, it would badly distort any impression of a contrary or entirely different nature when it received it, as its own features would shine through. So anything that is to receive in it every kind of character must be devoid of all character. Therefore, we must not call the mother and receptacle of visible, sensible things either earth or air or fire or water, nor yet any of their compounds or components, but we shall not be wrong if we describe it as invisible and formless, all-embracing, possessed in a most puzzling way of intelligibility, yet very hard to grasp. He also speaks of it like, for instance, if you're, let's say, if you're smelling perfume, you have to clear your sinuses, your nasal passages before you can smell it. If you're tasting wine, sometimes they'll give you a cracker to clean your palate. So you need to have this emptiness, these are all obviously metaphors that he's using, because the irony is that if we call, let's say, core a womb or a matrix is something that is actually present, but he can only access it through recourse to metaphor. And the same really is true of questions of being. For instance, Plato's going to describe the logos as a word that's written on the soul. Well, a word that's written on the soul, or as we're going to see, he'll compare it to a fire. A written word, a fire. Fire is something that really is there. And so when we speak of a fire that is the fire of being, what he'll also call in Timaeus the fire in itself, we're still grasping at something that is transcendental, and so we're speaking of it in metaphorical terms. Fire is a little bit more complicated, as we're going to see, because Plato does address this notion of a fire in itself. Okay. So now I've singled out here in this brief presentation some of the key passages in Plato's Timaeus that deal with matters of metaphysics. There are other passages we're going to look at when we talk about Plato's philosophy of embodiment and Plato and time. We'll spend a little bit more time sorting those things out. But if you focus on those particular passages, it's a great way to begin developing an understanding of these concepts. I realized that some of this material, particularly if you're coming into it for the first time, is quite complex. It's a bit like a foreign language, however. When you first hear a foreign language, you can be overwhelmed by it, but the more it's repeated, the more it becomes intelligible to you. So although some of these concepts may seem to you now to be challenging, the good news is that the more often they're repeated, the less challenging they become. But I would urge you, as you're preparing your course of study, to focus in on those concepts and to be able to readily identify each one of them and talk about each one of them. But we'll keep working on all three of these concepts as we focus on the different philosophers that we're going to be engaging this quarter, and the different writers, literary theorists, poets, and so on that we'll be addressing. So that's all for this lecture, and thank you for your patience. Also, those of you that are taking this as a course, you're going to have opportunity to ask questions, and we'll keep working on this together in the days to come.